What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks into what he believes will be a routine, friendly television interview, only to discover that the atmosphere is charged with something far more confrontational? That was the question many viewers found themselves asking after the now widely discussed exchange between Michael B. Jordan and Joy Behar on The View. The moment quickly became the subject of intense online debate, with clips circulating across social media platforms and audiences dissecting every glance, pause, and carefully chosen word. What began as a seemingly standard promotional appearance soon transformed into a tense and emotionally charged confrontation that left both the studio audience and viewers at home stunned. The studio lights shone brightly as Michael B. Jordan stepped onto the set, taking his place in the familiar semicircle of chairs that has become iconic for fans of the long-running talk show. Fresh from promoting his latest directorial project, he appeared relaxed and confident, embodying the calm professionalism that has defined much of his public persona. Known not only for his performances, but also for his thoughtful approach to storytelling, he seemed prepared for the usual mix of light-hearted banter and thoughtful questions about his work. The atmosphere at first felt welcoming. Whoopi Goldberg greeted him warmly, introducing him to viewers as an actor, director, and producer whose influence in Hollywood continues to grow. Her tone was gracious and celebratory, setting the expectation of a positive and engaging conversation. Michael responded with gratitude, flashing the easy smile that has endeared him to millions around the world. There was no visible tension in those opening moments, solely the rhythm of a familiar talk show format, playing out as expected. As the conversation began, Sarah Haynes asked about his latest film. Michael spoke with genuine enthusiasm about stepping behind the camera and embracing the challenges of directing. He described how directing had given him a deeper appreciation for storytelling and a stronger sense of responsibility toward the narratives he helps bring to life. He emphasized his desire to tell stories that matter, stories that amplify voices often overlooked in Hollywood. His words reflected both passion and purpose, revealing an artist committed to growth and representation. Sunny Hostin nodded in agreement, praising his consistent choice of socially relevant projects. She acknowledged the importance of representation in entertainment and commended him for using his platform to address meaningful themes. The exchange felt thoughtful and affirming, reinforcing the image of an accomplished actor navigating his career with intention and care. However, the tone shifted when Joy Behar leaned forward in her chair. Her posture and expression suggested that the direction of the conversation was about to change. With a pointed remark about social relevance, she steered the discussion toward criticism that had circulated in certain corners of the media. She questioned whether actors like Michael selectively engage in social issues, raising concerns about perceived inconsistencies in the people and projects they choose to align themselves with. The studio's energy subtly tightened. The other hosts exchanged glances that hinted at discomfort. Whoopi adjusted in her seat, and Sarah's expression suggested unease at the turn the discussion had taken. The question was no longer about artistic growth or creative passion. It was about accountability and perceived contradictions. Michael's smile softened, though he maintained his composure. Rather than reacting defensively, he asked for clarification, signaling both patience and a willingness to engage. Yet, as Joy elaborated, suggesting that he had worked with individuals whose records on diversity were questionable, the tension became unmistakable. His response was measured but firm. He rejected the characterization as unfair, asserting that he has been deliberate and thoughtful in his professional choices. There was a noticeable shift in his tone, a subtle steeliness that conveyed resolve without hostility. He emphasized the complexity of the industry, suggesting that no collaboration exists in isolation and that meaningful change often requires navigating imperfect systems. What unfolded in those moments was more than a disagreement. It was a clash of perspectives on responsibility, influence, and the realities of working within a multifaceted entertainment landscape. Viewers watching at home could sense that this was not the promotional interview they had anticipated. Instead, it had become a broader conversation about public expectation and personal integrity. As the discussion continued, each participant appeared acutely aware of the stakes not only for the conversation itself, but for how it would be interpreted beyond the studio walls. Social media later amplified every second, with supporters and critics alike weighing in on who was right, who was wrong, and whether the exchange had crossed a line. In the end, the interview served as a reminder of how quickly the tone of a live broadcast can shift and how public figures must navigate not only their craft, but also the scrutiny that accompanies it. What began as a celebration of creative achievement evolved into a moment of confrontation, one that left audiences debating long after the cameras stopped rolling. The tension in the studio deepened as Michael continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. He acknowledged that no single individual could control every decision made within an industry. As vast and complicated as Hollywood, I can't control every decision in this industry, he explained carefully, choosing his words with precision. But I can control my own actions and the stories I choose to tell. His statement was not defensive, but resolute, an attempt to clarify his personal philosophy rather than escalate the confrontation. However, Joy Behar was not ready to let the moment pass. Leaning forward once again, she challenged him directly. But don't you think actors in your position have a responsibility to do more than just control their own actions? She asked, her tone sharper than before. Shouldn't you use your platform to call out problems in Hollywood instead of talking about representation only when it's convenient for your image? Her words seemed to settle heavily over the room, as if the air itself had grown denser. The accusation did not simply question his professional choices, it suggested insincerity, implying that his advocacy might be calculated or selective. For a brief second, the audience fell silent, sensing that the conversation had crossed from critical inquiry into something more personal. Michael's jaw tightened, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the comment had struck a nerve. For the first time since he had taken his seat on the set of The View, the polished composure that usually defined his public appearances appeared to waver. He repeated her words slowly, almost incredulously, convenient for my image. The phrase lingered, echoing back to its source as though he were weighing its fairness. He paused before responding further, gathering himself. Joy, he began, his voice lower and more deliberate. I don't think you understand the work I do behind the scenes or the conversations I have privately. To create change in this industry, there was no raised voice, no overt display of anger, only a clear assertion that much of his advocacy existed beyond cameras and headlines. His statement suggested that not all progress is performative, and that meaningful change often happens quietly, away from public scrutiny. But Joy was quick to counter. Oh, but that's just it, she replied, her voice lifting slightly in volume. It's all behind the scenes. Her emphasis implied skepticism, as though private conversations were insufficient in a world where public accountability is increasingly demanded. She continued, contrasting his approach with that of other actors who, in her view, had taken visible and outspoken stands, sometimes at significant professional risk. The exchange revealed a deeper philosophical divide. On one side stood the argument that public figures must leverage their platforms loudly and unmistakably, even if doing so jeopardizes future opportunities. On the other stood the belief that change can be pursued through strategic, behind-the-scenes efforts through mentorship, hiring practices, development deals, and quiet influence within decision-making rooms. Michael appeared to struggle with the implication that he had chosen convenience over courage. His career had been built on a careful balance of artistic ambition and social awareness, and this suggestion that his efforts were merely image management clearly unsettled him. Yet even as the tension escalated, he resisted the temptation to match volume with volume. Instead, he maintained a controlled intensity, signaling that while he felt the weight of the accusation, he would not allow it to derail his composure. Entirely round them, the other hosts seemed increasingly aware of the fragile atmosphere. The studio audience remained unusually quiet, sensing that the conversation had moved beyond typical talk show sparring into something far more pointed. This was no longer about a single project or promotional appearance. It had become a broader debate about celebrity responsibility, authenticity, and the expectations placed upon public figures in an era of heightened social consciousness. Joy's assertion that other actors take real risks hung in the air as a challenge, one that implicitly questioned whether Michael had done enough. It was a powerful rhetorical move, framing activism something that must be visible and costly to be considered genuine. Yet it also risked oversimplifying the varied ways individuals choose to engage with systemic issues. The moment captured the complexity of navigating fame in modern Hollywood. Actors are not only expected to entertain, but also to serve as moral voices, cultural commentators, and agents of change. The scrutiny they face extends far beyond their performances on screen. It reaches into their partnerships, their silence, and even the timing of their statements. As the discussion continued, it was clear that this was no longer a routine interview. It had evolved into a confrontation about values and methods, about whether impact must be allowed to be legitimate, and whether quiet advocacy could ever satisfy a public that increasingly demands visible action. The intensity of the exchange underscored how difficult it can be for artists to reconcile personal strategy with public expectation, especially under the unforgiving spotlight of live television. The confrontation intensified as Joy delivered another pointed remark, suggesting that while others risked their careers to speak out publicly, Michael seemed comfortable securing blockbuster deals and maintaining his position at the top of the industry. The implication was clear: success and activism, in her framing, appeared incompatible. It was a statement designed to provoke, and it landed with undeniable force. Before the tension could escalate further, Whoopi Goldberg attempted to step in. "Joy, I think we should," she began, clearly aiming to redirect the conversation, or at least soften its tone. But Joy quickly cut her off. "No, Whoopi, I think this is important," she insisted. Her voice carried conviction, as though she believed she was performing a necessary service. "The public deserves to know where their favorite stars stand, not just the carefully crafted public relations version." The phrase "carefully crafted public relations version" echoed sharply through the studio. It implied artifice, calculation, and image management. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, absorbing what was unfolding. His posture suggested not retreat, but recalibration. He appeared to be choosing his next words with extreme care, aware that anything he said could either diffuse the situation or ignite it further. The other hosts looked visibly uncomfortable. Their expressions reflected surprise, even embarrassment, at the direction the exchange had taken. Yet Joy seemed energized by the confrontation. Her body language conveyed confidence, even satisfaction, as though she believed she was cutting through superficiality to reveal something more honest. "Joy, I think you're operating from a fundamental misunderstanding of who I am and what I stand for," Michael said finally. His voice, while controlled, now carried a sharper edge. The warmth that had defined the earlier portion of the interview had faded. In its place was a firm assertion of identity. "Am I?" Joy shot back immediately, unwilling to concede ground. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like another Hollywood actor who talks a good game about social justice on camera, but plays it safe when it matters." Her words drew an audible reaction from the audience. A low murmur spread across the studio, some viewers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others leaning forward, captivated by the unexpected intensity. The atmosphere felt charged, almost electric. What had begun as a promotional appearance had evolved into something far more volatile. Michael inhaled deeply, a visible attempt to steady himself. It was the breath of someone reaching a breaking point, not out of loss of control, but out of exhaustion with the narrative being constructed around him. "You know what, Joy?" he began, his tone no longer purely measured. "I came here today expecting to have a conversation about my work, the stories I'm trying to tell, and the positive impact I'm trying to make. Instead, You've chosen to ambush me with accusations based on assumptions about my character and my commitment. Two causes I care deeply about. The word ambush hung in the air. Sharp and unmistakable ambush, Joy responded with a dismissive laugh. I'm asking the questions your fans want answers to. I'm holding you accountable. The exchange had clearly moved beyond disagreement into a battle over intent. Michael's composure, though still present, was visibly strained. No, he replied firmly, his voice rising for the first time during the interview. You're grandstanding. The term struck like a counterpunch. It suggested performance not on his part, but on hers. You're creating conflict where none exists because it makes for good television, he continued, his words deliberate and unflinching. And honestly, it's beneath what this show usually represents. The statement carried weight. It wasn't just a defense of himself. It was a critique of the direction the program had taken in that moment. The implication was that the show, known for spirited but meaningful discussion, was drifting into spectacle at the expense of substance. The tension in the studio became almost tangible. Camera operators instinctively tightened their shots, zooming in to capture every flicker of expression, every tightening jaw and narrowed eye. Producers likely communicated urgently through headsets, assessing whether to cut to commercial or allow the exchange to continue. The audience remained hushed, aware that they were witnessing something raw and unscripted. Some viewers seemed sympathetic to Michael, perceiving him as unfairly targeted. Others appeared intrigued by Joy's insistence on pressing the issue. The divide in the room mirrored the divide that would later unfold across social media platforms. At its core, the confrontation was no longer about a single actor's choices. It had become a broader debate about public accountability, authenticity, and the expectations placed on celebrities in an era where silence can be interpreted as complicity. Joy framed her questions as necessary scrutiny. Michael framed them as unfair character attacks disguised as journalism. Both perspectives carried weight, but the clash between them exposed the fragility of live television. Without the buffer of editing or careful scripting, every word felt amplified. Every pause felt loaded with meaning as the seconds stretched. It was clear that the interview had crossed a threshold. What remained uncertain was whether it would resolve into understanding or spiral further into conflict. The atmosphere inside the studio had shifted so dramatically that it was impossible to ignore. Camera operators adjusted their angles, zooming in closer as if instinctively aware that something significant was unfolding. Producers likely whispered urgent instructions into headsets behind the scenes, weighing whether to intervene or let the confrontation continue. The energy in the room felt charged, heavy with anticipation. The other hosts sat unusually still, their earlier warmth replaced by visible uncertainty. No one seemed quite sure how to step into the increasingly hostile exchange between their colleague and their guest. It was no longer a spirited debate. It had evolved into something sharper, more personal. The silence from the rest of the panel amplified the tension rather than diffusing it. Joy's eyes flashed with what could only be described as satisfaction. There was a glint there, an unmistakable signal that she believed she had struck a nerve. Oh, so now I'm grandstanding, she replied, her tone edged with sarcasm. That's interesting coming from someone whose entire career has been built on carefully managed public appearances and safe choices. The words safe choices echoed loudly in the quiet studio. They weren't merely criticism of professional strategy. They were a direct challenge to his courage, his authenticity, and perhaps even his integrity. The accusation suggested that his success had come not from risk-taking or conviction, but from calculated image management. Michael's expression shifted. The warmth that once defined his demeanor had disappeared entirely. His voice, when he responded, dropped to a low, controlled register, quiet but intense. It was the kind of tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Those familiar with him would recognize it as a warning. He was no longer content to absorb the accusations passively. Safe choices, he repeated slowly as though testing the words for accuracy. Then he leaned forward slightly. Joy, you clearly haven't done your homework. The statement landed firmly, not as an insult, but as a pointed rebuttal. His composure was still intact, but the restraint was thinning. "You want to talk about taking risks," he continued, his voice steady but increasingly forceful. "Let's talk about the millions I've invested in Black-owned businesses. Let's talk about the production company I started to create opportunities for underrepresented filmmakers. Let's talk about the mentorship programs I fund, programs you've never bothered to research." Each example was delivered with emphasis, as if he were laying evidence on a table. The shift in his posture and cadence made it clear that he felt misrepresented. He wasn't merely defending his reputation. He was defending work that he believed had tangible impact. For a moment, the studio audience seemed unsure how to react. Some faces showed surprise, others admiration. The tension had evolved from accusatory to confrontational, with both parties now fully engaged. But Joy responded with a dismissive wave of her hand, as though brushing aside his points. "Anyone with money can write checks, Michael," she said. "I'm talking about using your voice when it matters, when there are real consequences." Her words reframed the argument yet again. To her, financial investment was insufficient if not accompanied by outspoken public advocacy. The implication was that true risk required visible defiance. Statements that might jeopardize contracts, endorsements, or relationships within the industry. Real consequences, she repeated for emphasis. At that point, Michael's composure visibly faltered, not in a loss of control sense, but in the subtle ways that signal emotional strain. The tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the longer pause before he spoke. The cracks in his polished exterior were beginning to show. For much of his career, he had been known for measured responses and thoughtful commentary, but being repeatedly portrayed as opportunistic or insincere was clearly pushing him toward a limit. The exchange was no longer about abstract philosophy. It had become personal, about his identity, his intentions, and the unseen labor he believed deserved acknowledgement. The studio remained hushed, as though everyone present understood. They were witnessing a pivotal moment. The debate had escalated from critique to challenge, from disagreement to confrontation, and as Michael prepared to respond once more, it was clear that the breaking point was dangerously close.